A retired officer, writing from his home in Long Beach, California, in the spring of 1962, set down a single paragraph that would end up quoted in 3 separate naval history journals over the following decade. His name was not famous. He had commanded a secondary fire control station aboard a vessel he referred to only as the Old Lady for 6 years, from her recommissioning in 1942 to her final deactivation in 1948. The paragraph read, in part, "We believed, all of us, from the admiral down to the lowest seaman deuce, that we were the most powerful thing on the ocean. We believed it the way you believe gravity is real. And then one morning we woke up and the entire reason we existed had been cancelled. Not defeated. Cancelled. They didn't sink us. They made us unnecessary. And that was worse." He was describing the morning he learned his ship, a 40,000-ton fast battleship, bristling with 9 16-inch guns capable of hurling a projectile the weight of a small automobile more than 20 miles, would never again fire those guns in anger. Not because she had failed, because she had succeeded at everything asked of her, and it had not mattered. The war had moved past her. The weapon that was supposed to be the final arbiter of sea power, the weapon around which every navy on Earth had organized its entire strategic doctrine for 40 years, had been rendered obsolete in the space of roughly 36 months. And here is what is remarkable. The men who built them knew it was happening while it was happening. They watched it in real time. They resisted the conclusion, then accepted it, then tried to reinvent the thing they had just admitted was finished. This is not the familiar story, the one about Pearl Harbor, about revenge, about the Great Pacific Offensive. That story exists in 1,000 documentaries, and it ends with a flag over Tokyo Bay. This script is about something else. It is about the largest, most expensive, most powerful class of warship ever constructed by any nation, a fleet of fast battleships that the United States spent the equivalent of tens of billions of modern dollars building across 2 decades, and what actually happened to them. Not in myth, in mechanism. And the clearest way to understand that mechanism is not through American accounts alone. It is through the assessments, the confessions, and the slow, reluctant admissions of the men who fought against them, and the men within America's own Navy, who planned their obsolescence even as the last rivets were being driven into their hulls. This is the story of America's massive World War II battleship fleet, 10 fast battleships of the North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa classes, joined by the old standards rebuilt after Pearl Harbor, told not as triumph and not as tragedy but as the most expensive lesson in the history of naval warfare. The version you know features sweeping gun salvos and Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The version documented in after-action reports, Japanese naval intelligence summaries, and internal U.S. Navy planning memoranda is stranger, more paradoxical, and far more revealing. It is the story of a weapon that dominated every tactical engagement it entered and yet lost the strategic argument about its own existence. It is told most honestly by the people who watched it happen from the other side. To understand what the battleship fleet became, you have to understand what it was supposed to be, and that means understanding the naval world as it existed in the minds of Japanese strategists in the years before the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy, by 1941, possessed arguably the most sophisticated battleship doctrine on Earth. It was built around a single, elegant premise: decisive battle. The concept, rooted in the victory at Tsushima in 1905 and refined across 3 decades of wargaming at the Naval War College in Tokyo, held that a Pacific War between Japan and the United States would be settled by one great fleet engagement, battleship against battleship, line against line, somewhere in the Western Pacific. Japan's numerical inferiority in capital ships, codified by the Washington and London naval treaties at a ratio of roughly 5-3 against the United States, was to be offset by superior quality. The ships prioritized survivability in design to a degree not matched by our own construction philosophy, but this was seen as a defensive virtue, not an offensive one. The Americans, in the Japanese framework, would fight competently, absorb losses, and eventually be ground down by attrition warfare conducted by submarines and land-based air before the decisive battle. The battleships would be the final instrument, not the first. And that model had a certain internal coherence. Until it didn't. The first indication that the American battleship fleet did not fit neatly into existing Japanese models came not from a surface engagement but from an absence. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which sank or damaged 8 American battleships of the old standard type, Japanese naval intelligence expected a period of American paralysis. The Pacific Fleet's battle line had been functionally destroyed. According to pre-war doctrine, this should have created a window of roughly 18 to 24 months during which Japan could consolidate its defensive perimeter without serious capital ship opposition. A naval intelligence officer attached to the combined fleet staff, his report, dated February 1942, was recovered from captured documents after the war, wrote with evident confidence that the American replacement timeline for the lost battleships was not less than 30 months, assuming maximum industrial mobilization. In the margin of a subsequent copy circulated within the Second Fleet staff, someone had penciled a single word: longer. They were wrong. Not by weeks. By an order of magnitude in the wrong direction. The United States did not attempt to replace the sunken battleships one for one. It raised most of them from the mud of Pearl Harbor, repaired them, and simultaneously accelerated the construction of an entirely new generation of fast battleships that had been laid down before the war. USS North Carolina had been commissioned in April 1941. USS Washington followed in May. By mid-1942, both were operational in the Pacific. South Dakota was commissioned in March 1942. Indiana in April. Massachusetts in May. Alabama in August. The speed was, by any prior industrial standard, extraordinary. But more disorienting to Japanese planners than the speed was the nature of the ships themselves. These were not replacements for the old battle line. They were something categorically different. Fast battleships capable of making 27 to 33 knots, designed not to fight in a traditional line of battle but to operate as escorts for the new fast carrier task forces. A Japanese intelligence update from late 1942, analyzing reports from submarine sightings and signals intercepts, noted the emergence of these ships with visible unease. The analyst wrote, "The Americans appear to be deploying new capital ships not as a concentrated battle force but distributed among carrier groups. This is inconsistent with all known doctrine for the employment of heavy gun vessels. Recommend verification through additional sources. This does not match our prior observations of American fleet organization." Verification came. Confirmed the original report. The Americans were doing something the Japanese had no model for. They were using battleships as screens. Why did the American fast battleships perform the way they did? Not as queens of the fleet but as the most powerful bodyguards in naval history. The answer lies in a doctrinal shift that was neither accidental nor sudden but was nonetheless invisible to outside observers until it manifested in combat. Beginning in 1942, under the pressure of carrier-centric warfare in the Coral Sea and at Midway, the U.S. Navy's tactical doctrine evolved with a speed that peacetime bureaucracies rarely achieve. The fast battleships were integrated into the carrier task force structure under a concept that prioritized anti-aircraft defense, shore bombardment, and surface screening over independent battle line operations. This was not a demotion. It was a redefinition. The ship's extraordinary speed, the Iowa class could sustain 33 knots, faster than most heavy cruisers, allowed them to keep pace with carriers. Their massive anti-aircraft batteries, expanded dramatically through 1943 and 1944, made them floating fortresses against air attack. A single Iowa-class battleship, by late 1944, carried approximately 20 quadruple-mounted 40mm Bofors guns and 49 20mm Oerlikon cannons in addition to her main and secondary batteries. She could put up a wall of steel that made approaching aircraft fly through what one pilot later described as a solid ceiling of light. Dr. Norman Friedman, the naval historian and analyst, identified the key structural quality in precise terms. The U.S. Navy had achieved a degree of tactical integration between carrier aviation and surface gunnery that no other navy attempted at comparable scale, and the fast battleships were the physical connective tissue of that integration. They were not obsolete. They were repurposed violently, rapidly, and with a ruthlessness toward their own institutional mythology that only a navy fighting for survival could have managed. The men who had trained their entire careers to fight the decisive gun battle were told, in effect, that the decisive gun battle was not coming, and they would now serve the aircraft carriers. And they did it. The night action off Guadalcanal on November 14 to 15, 1942, provided the first concrete evidence that the new American fast battleships were not merely escorts but lethal combatants in their own right. The engagement, which took place in the confined waters of Iron Bottom Sound, pitted USS Washington and USS South Dakota against the Japanese battleship Kirishima and her escorts, including the heavy cruiser Atago and a screening force of destroyers. The Japanese force, commanded by Vice Admiral Nobite Kondo, had been tasked with bombarding Henderson Field to neutralize American air operations on the island. Kondo's plan was sound. His force outnumbered the American surface group, and the narrow waters favored the Japanese advantage in night fighting tactics, particularly the use of the long lance torpedo. The action began at approximately 2,300 hours. South Dakota, suffering an electrical failure that knocked out her radar and fire control systems at a critical moment, became the focus of Japanese fire. She was hit by at least 26 shells from multiple Japanese ships and was temporarily rendered combat ineffective. For a brief period, Washington was alone. What happened next was documented by a Japanese officer aboard one of the screening destroyers, whose account was recorded during post-war interrogation. He stated, "We were concentrating all fire on the damaged American battleship. We did not detect the second ship. She opened fire from approximately 8,000 meters. The first salvo struck Kirishima amidships. We did not understand where it had come from. There was no radar contact preceding the fire. It was as though a ship had materialized from the darkness." Washington, under the command of Captain Glenn Davis, had used her superior SG radar to track Kirishima while remaining undetected. In approximately 7 minutes between 0100 and 0107 hours on November 15th, she fired 75 16-inch shells and struck Kirishima with at least 9 of them, along with approximately 45-inch secondary hits. Kirishima was wrecked. Her steering was destroyed. Fires raged uncontrollably, and she was scuttled by her own crew before dawn. An intelligence analyst reviewing the after-action report at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk wrote a marginal note that would be discovered in captured records. 1 ship. 7 minutes. This rate of accurate fire in darkness has not been observed from any navy, including our own. It was the first time a U.S. fast battleship had sunk an enemy capital ship in a surface action. It would also, as it turned out, be very nearly the last. Not because the battleships failed, but because the opportunities for such engagements were vanishing. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known colloquially and somewhat dismissively as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, marked an escalation in scale that rendered the Guadalcanal action a footnote. Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, included 7 fast battleships formed into a dedicated battle line. Task Group 58.7, under Vice Admiral Willis Lee, the same officer who had commanded Washington at Guadalcanal. Lee's battleship group was positioned approximately 15 miles ahead of the carrier groups, forming a forward anti-aircraft screen. The Japanese mobile fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, launched approximately 373 carrier aircraft in 4 raids across the day of June 19th. The expectation, based on every prior engagement, was that a significant percentage of these aircraft would penetrate the American screen and strike the carriers. That expectation was the product of reasonable military logic. What we encountered was not normal. The sky ahead of the carriers was a wall. Aircraft that entered it did not come out. I turned back after seeing 3 aircraft ahead of me disintegrate in less than 2 seconds. I do not know what weapon did this. The weapon he could not identify was almost certainly the proximity-fused 5-inch shell, fired in volume from the battleship's secondary batteries. Each shell contained a miniature radar that detonated the round when it passed within lethal range of an aircraft, eliminating the need for a direct hit. It was a technological revolution in anti-aircraft warfare, and the fast battleships were its primary delivery platform. An American Ordnance report noted that the battleships of Task Group 58.7 fired approximately 4,000 5-inch rounds during the June 19th engagements. The expenditure was staggering, but the result was decisive. A Japanese staff officer, writing a post-battle assessment that was intercepted and partially decrypted by American intelligence, attempted to account for the losses. His analysis considered pilot quality, American fighter superiority, and the possibility of a new weapon system, but concluded with a sentence that revealed the depth of the confusion. The defensive capacity of the American surface screen exceeds any value predicted by our models. If these results are repeatable, the viability of massed carrier strikes against screened formations must be fundamentally reassessed. The conditional phrasing, "if these results are repeatable," was the last thread of institutional hope. The results were repeatable. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 provided the climax, and it did so with a cruelty that seemed almost engineered to expose every remaining illusion about the battleship's role in modern warfare. The engagement was the largest naval battle in history by virtually every metric: number of ships engaged, total tonnage, and geographic scope. It sprawled across 4 distinct actions separated by hundreds of miles, and 2 of them involved American battleships in roles so different they might have belonged to separate wars. In the Surigao Strait on the night of October 24th to 25th, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf commanded a force that included 6 old battleships, 5 of them raised from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor. West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, joined by Mississippi, formed a battle line across the northern mouth of the strait and waited for the Japanese southern force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. What followed was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. Oldendorf had achieved the ancient tactical ideal of crossing the T. His line of battle was perpendicular to the approaching Japanese column, allowing all his guns to bear while the enemy could respond with only forward turrets. The bombardment began at approximately 0353 hours. West Virginia, equipped with the most modern fire control radar, opened fire first, at a range of approximately 22,000 yards. Within 18 minutes, the Japanese battleship Yamashiro was struck by multiple 16-inch and 14-inch salvos, along with dozens of cruiser and destroyer hits. She capsized and sank with most of her crew. Her sister ship Fuso had already been broken in half by torpedo attacks earlier in the approach. Of Nishimura's 7-ship force, only 1 destroyer survived. The action was, by any traditional measure, a perfect victory. It was also a eulogy. The men who fought it knew, even in the moment, that they were performing the final act of a doctrine that would never be employed again. A sailor aboard West Virginia later recalled the eerie feeling of firing guns that had been silent since December 7, 1941, at an enemy battle line. "We were settling a debt. Every man aboard knew it. But we also knew this was the last time. The battle wagons had their night. One night. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the north, a catastrophe was unfolding that demonstrated the new reality with brutal clarity. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, which included the super battleship Yamato, had transited the San Bernardino Strait and fallen upon a group of American escort carriers and destroyers, Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, that were never designed to fight a surface engagement. The fast battleships of Task Force 34, which should have been guarding the strait, had been drawn north by Admiral William Halsey's pursuit of the Japanese carrier decoy force under Ozawa. The absence of those battleships nearly produced a disaster. Taffy 3's thin-skinned escort carriers and their handful of destroyers fought a desperate, sacrificial action against Kurita's force, which included Yamato, 3 other battleships, and multiple heavy cruisers. The destroyers attacked with torpedoes at suicidal range. The escort carrier aircraft, some armed with nothing but depth charges and machine guns, made dry runs against battleships to buy time. A Japanese officer aboard heavy cruiser Tone later said, in recorded testimony, "We could not understand why these small ships were attacking us. They had no chance. Their torpedoes were coming from every direction. Their aircraft were diving on us with no bombs. It was not courage in any way I had been trained to recognize. It was something else. I have thought about it for many years since, and I still do not have the correct word." The engagement ended when Kurita, battered, confused by the ferocity of the defense, and believing he was facing a much larger force, withdrew. He turned Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, away from a group of escort carriers. The most devastating assessment came not from the American side, but from a Japanese naval staff analysis written in November 1944. The decisive battle, as conceived in all pre-war planning, occurred at Leyte Gulf, produced no decisive result for our forces. The American Fleet Organization, integrating carriers, battleships, submarines, and land-based air into a single operational system, cannot be defeated by any combination of forces currently available to the Imperial Navy. The battleship, as an independent instrument of sea power, has been superseded. That last sentence, buried on page 14 of a 40-page internal memorandum, was the death certificate. After the war, the reckoning came in stages, and it came from both sides. Japanese officers, writing under the supervision of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and the various war crimes and historical interview programs, produced a body of analysis that was remarkably candid. Captain Toshikazu Omi, who had served as a senior staff officer in the combined fleet, wrote that the fundamental Japanese error was not a failure of courage or of technology but a failure of imagination. We designed our fleet to fight one kind of battle. The Americans designed their fleet to fight any kind of battle. Their battleships were the clearest expression of this, ships built for one purpose that were successfully employed for half a dozen others, including several that did not exist when the ships were designed. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had served as Chief of Staff of the combined fleet, offered a different angle in his post-war interrogation. He focused not on the ships but on the system. The American battleship was not, by itself, superior to Yamato in armor or armament. But it was never by itself. It operated within a network of radar, aviation, logistics, and communication that multiplied its effectiveness beyond anything we could match. We understood the individual components. We did not understand the integration. A third perspective came from Captain Atsushi Oi, who had commanded submarine operations and had studied the American fleet from the perspective of undersea warfare. His assessment was the most blunt. The Americans did what we could not do. They abandoned their own orthodoxy. They had spent 20 years building a battle fleet organized around the battleship, and when the evidence showed that the carrier had replaced the battleship as the decisive weapon, they reorganized their entire fleet in less than 2 years. We saw the same evidence. We could not reorganize. That is the difference. Each of these men was describing, from a slightly different vantage, the same phenomenon, institutional adaptability at a scale and speed that the Imperial Japanese Navy, for all its tactical brilliance, could not replicate. The old fire control officer in Long Beach, the one who had written about waking up to find his ship's purpose canceled, revised his own account in a letter written in 1971, 9 years after the original paragraph was published. The letter was addressed to a former shipmate and was later donated to the Naval History and Heritage Command Archive. In it, he corrected himself not on any factual point but on the emotional framing. I wrote that they made us unnecessary, he said. That was wrong, or at least incomplete. We were not unnecessary. We were transitional. We were the bridge between the Navy that existed before the war and the Navy that existed after it. The fast battleships did not lose the argument about sea power. They helped settle it. Every time we screened those carriers, every time we put up a wall of flak that stopped an air raid, every time we turned those 16-inch guns on a beachhead and broke open a Japanese defensive line so that Marines could advance, we were proving, with our own bodies and our own guns, that the future did not belong to us. We were the most powerful argument for our own obsolescence. And if that sounds like a sad thing, you are not understanding it correctly. We did not fade away because we failed. We were consumed by the very victory we helped to build. There is no more honorable end for a warship than to succeed so completely that the next generation does not need her. The 10 fast battleships of the United States Navy, North Carolina, Washington, South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts, Alabama, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin, were the last capital ships of the gun age. They were designed to fight a battle that never came in the form their designers imagined. They fought instead in a war that reinvented them, and they adapted with a speed and flexibility that their enemies, by their own admission, could not match and could not explain. They were not the pinnacle of naval power. They were the pivot point, and the proof is not in what America said about them. It is in what Japan admitted.